The Fire Dragon's Hunt by Mary Fan. Chapter 1. The Shadow Beast. How do you kill a monster without a shape? A monster you can barely even see. Aurelia rushed out of the Scarlet Citadel, clutching her double swords, and raced across a wide field of winter-dry grass. Cries of alarm peppered the night. In the distance, 4 of her fellow rebels, riding growling motorbikes, charged out of the dark forest toward the base's enchanted barrier, which shimmered like silver mist. Behind them, what looked like an enormous shadow towered over them and slithered across the ground in pursuit. Though she tried to convince herself they'd make it, anxiety gripped her chest. She had to help them. A cold wind blasted Aurelia's face. She urged her legs to carry her faster toward the monster. She'd only been with the Rising for a few weeks, but she considered herself a part of the rebellion, and she couldn't let her teammates fall to that creature, whatever it was. She'd never seen anything like it, and that was saying something. At 15, she'd already encountered nearly every type of supernatural beast on record. She'd been trained practically since birth to do one thing: gank monsters. Because of her small-ish physique, her round golden cheeks, and her almost childlike black eyes, people often found it hard to believe that before she'd run away from the corrupt Triumvirate to join the rebellion, she'd been their best monster fighter. Her prowess had earned her the nickname the Fire Dragon. Ever since the Lord of the Underworld escaped his dark dimension a century ago, the supernaturals he'd released had been running amok all over the earth. By the time the Sentinels, an elite class of enchanters, managed to defeat the Lord, there wasn't much left to save. And upon the ashes of the former United States, the Sentinels set up the Triumvirate, which treated those born without magic, like Aurelia, as if they were slaves to be commanded. Sick of their crap, Aurelia had run away from her government-appointed guardians to join the Rising, an underground rebellion. But without the protection of the Sentinels, they were vulnerable to supernatural attacks. Still, the Fire Dragon feared no monster. The 4 motorbikes of her fellow risers roared closer. Once they crossed the Citadel's enchanted perimeter, they'd be safe. But that monster would still be out there, and Aurelia aimed to get rid of it once and for all. It had already killed 2, a rebel returning from a mission a few weeks ago, and a guard patrolling the Citadel's perimeter just yesterday. The Rising's numbers were low as it was. They couldn't afford to lose any more. Aurelia's long black hair streamed behind her as she sprinted at her target. The monster's undulating mask bore down on the risers. One tendril snapped forward and seized the person in the back. The man's scream hurtled past Aurelia's ears. He vanished into the shadows, and the sound cut out abruptly. Cold horror filled her chest. It was hardly the first death she'd witnessed, but that didn't make it any easier. The other 3 motorbikes tore through the perimeter. At least they were safe. The shadowy creature pressed into the subtly glowing mist. Instead of screeching and retreating like an ordinary monster, it began seeping through. Aurelia drew to a halt, her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid of that thing. She couldn't let herself be. But if it got through, the entire rebellion, the nation's only hope for freedom, was vulnerable. She swallowed hard and raised her swords. Before she could step past the enchanted barrier, a hand gripped her shoulder. Golden light filled her vision, and heat enveloped her body. The next thing she knew, she was back at the Citadel's front door, several yards away from the perimeter. She looked up to see Tamerlane, a red-headed enchanter with the Rising, and realized he must have gold-lighted her away. Irritation shot through her, both at Tamerlane for stopping her and herself for not seeing him coming. "What'd you do that for, dummy?" She yanked her shoulder out of his grasp. "I was about to gank that thing." Even the Fire Dragon can't destroy what you can't see. With his narrow face and nerdy demeanor, Tamerlane looked like he belonged in a library, not a rebel hideout. "All you would have done was gotten yourself killed." "Yeah, right." But despite her arrogant tone, nervousness crept into her heart as she watched the monster seep further and further into the barrier, its black shape intermingling with the silver mist. Meanwhile, the 3 remaining risers zoomed across the field on their motorbikes, heading for the lot behind the Citadel. Tamerlane vanished in a flash of light and reappeared several yards in front of her, facing the monster. He muttered some Latin mumbo-jumbo, too softly for Aurelia to make out the exact words, and silver sparks shot out from the orange wand he held out before him. The barrier spell's mist grew thicker, crowding out the monster. Aurelia sprinted forward again, her tough black boots barely touching the ground. Tamerlane may have been reinforcing the barrier, but that wouldn't stop the monster forever. She couldn't let it remain out there, where it might kill again. An angry, hissing noise whooshed past her. The shadowy monster retreated, apparently discouraged by Tamerlane's magic. He kept his wand up nonetheless, scattering sparks across the barrier. Aurelia raced through the perimeter, but stopped in her tracks. The monster was nowhere in sight. Or perhaps it was nearby, but camouflaged among the shadows of the haunted woods. She clanged her swords together. Metal fire! At the magic words, the twin blades glowed gold. She held them out before her, searching. Firedragon! Tamerlane ran up to her. Let it go. You'd be better off searching for it when it's light. Aurelia huffed. Fine. She marched back to the Citadel, a broad, grayish-white building with a semicircle of columns across the front. Hey, you've read a lot of books. Ever come across anything about a giant shadow monster? Tamerlane shook his head. If anyone's encountered something like this before, they must not have lived long enough to tell the tale. Either that, or it hasn't been seen in so long, people forgot about it. Weird. Aurelia glanced over her shoulder at the spot where she'd last seen the monster. Somehow, she'd figure out what it was. And more importantly, she'd find a way to kill it. She'd never lost to a monster before, and she didn't plan to start now. Chapter 2. Seeking. Aurelia slammed the heavy, leather-bound book shut. The complete guide to obscure supernatural beings was apparently anything but. Though she managed to learn about several monsters she'd never heard of before, not one of the entries sounded even close to the weird shadow monster that had been attacking the rebels. Her stomach grumbled. She'd skipped breakfast out of impatience. Not that there was much in the kitchen anyway, and her body was demanding lunch. But she wasn't ready to go just yet. She hopped out of the old, smelly chair she'd spent the morning curled up in and strode across the wide room. Bookshelves lined the wall, covering nearly all the peeling taupe paint. She paused before one beside a large window, tiptoed, and jammed the book back into its spot. Her head almost brushed the hovering white sphere floating near the cracked ceiling. At present, it did nothing more than hang there. But, once the light grew dim, the enchanted lantern would illuminate. Judging by the bright sun outside, several hours remained before that would happen. Aurelia scanned the spines of the worn books filling the Scarlet Citadel's one-room library, dragging her gaze across gilded letters and faded but still colorful spines. Before the Rising had captured the Citadel 20 years ago and made it their headquarters, the building had been a sentinel outpost. The sentinels had kept the place well-stocked with everything they'd needed to fight supernaturals, from weapons to knowledge. The Risers had stripped the place of the Triumvirate's outward trappings, ugly flags and portraits of the evil triumvirs and whatnot, but they'd kept the useful stuff, like books. Aurelia glimpsed several titles on monster lore she'd read previously, but found nothing new that might help her. Her muscles itched for action, and she longed to go upstairs to the training room instead. Whacking the heavy bag was a lot more fun than turning pages. Not that she minded reading. Though many of her fellow cadets back at the Academy of Supernatural Defense had grumbled about having to sit in classrooms when they'd rather be fighting, Aurelia was well aware that sometimes knowledge was the most powerful weapon, and lack of knowledge was the worst vulnerability, especially when dealing with monsters. Many were invulnerable to ordinary weapons and could only be killed using certain tools or spells. There was only one exception. Beheading a monster with a silver blade always worked. Unless the thing doesn't have a head. Aurelia pursed her lips, thinking back to the few glimpses she'd gotten of the mysterious creature. All she remembered was a giant black blob. No neck to chop. This is gonna be tough. Did they manage to retrieve anything? A gruff voice shot through the library's open door. Recognizing the voice of Frank Calhoun, leader of the Rising, Aurelia whirled. Like her, Calhoun was a Norm who possessed no magic. Yet the enchanters in the Rising listened to him anyway, because he had the vision. Someday, the rest of the Triumvirate would think that way as well, instead of always looking down at the non-magical. Unfortunately, no. That deep alto belonged to Fiona Nossiter, another Norm. She was effectively Calhoun's second in command. I'm afraid yesterday's mission was for nothing. Aurelia's stomach sank, and grumbled again. The Citadel's provisions were running dangerously low, and the Riser's latest mission had been a quest to steal food from a nearby Triumvirate warehouse. But they'd had to dump the cargo while escaping the strange monster. A few people had gone out in the morning, hoping to retrieve it. By the sounds of things, they'd failed. Hoping to learn more, she edged quietly toward the door. We'll have to try again. Calhoun passed in full view. A thin, white-haired man with fair skin and ice-blue eyes. He certainly didn't look like he should be leading a rebellion. More like sitting in a rocking chair on some porch. But in the few weeks she'd known him, Aurelia had come to realize that he was the toughest guy in the world, even if he was older than the hills. Call a meeting. I don't think that's a good idea. Nossiter stopped and crossed her arms. Her broad mouth formed a hard line across her subtly lined mahogany face. That beast is still out there, and we have no idea how to fight it. It's already claimed 3 risers, and our numbers are thin to begin with. No one should be out in the woods, whether they're going to or coming from the Citadel. You make it sound like we're under siege. We might as well be. Unless we find a way to deal with that creature, this could spell disaster for the Rising. Calhoun's expression darkened. Agitation churned in Aurelia's chest. Nossiter was right. The Rising couldn't keep sending people beyond the protective barrier with the monster lurking. Yet, neither could they hole up in the Citadel forever. They only had a few days' worth of food left. And what was the point of rebellion if they couldn't do anything to rebel? Someone had to do something. Aurelia scampered out of the room and approached the two. She tried not to think of them as the olds, since that was disrespectful. But she couldn't help it. They were her grandparents' age, after all. Not that she'd ever known her grandparents, or her parents, for that matter. Calhoun and Nossiter turned to her as she slid to a halt, grabbing the railing that separated the corridor, which was on the Citadel's second floor, from the air above the grand hall below. I can go on a supply run! Aurelia bounced on her toes. I won't need to bring anyone. I can nick a few bags of food from the Triumvirate by myself. And you know I can handle any monster, even this weird shadowy thing. Calhoun shook his head. Sorry, Firedragon, but my current orders stand. You're to stay in the Citadel unless I say otherwise. Why? She put her hands on her hips. I've been here for weeks, and all you've let me do is guard the perimeter. You said when I got here that you could use a good fighter like me. So why won't you let me fight? Nossiter gave her a firm look. You're too young and impulsive, and you're doing nothing to help your case right now. Calhoun nodded. You're a blunt weapon, kid. While I appreciate your strength and skills, what I need is a precision tool. Someone who can slip in and out of the Triumvirate's warehouse without getting caught and without leading them right to our base. Aurelia scowled. Are you saying I can't be stealthy? I've seen the way you fight. You see a target, you rush in, and you strike. Never mind what else is going on. Now, I understand that works well when you just need to kill a monster before it kills you. But things are more complicated here. Oh? How? The monster isn't the only thing lurking in the woods by the Citadel. Calhoun sighed. Tamerlane spotted a Triumvirate patrol when he was out with the others this morning trying to retrieve the supplies. Apparently, they caught a whiff of our scent after last night's mission. One wrong move could lead them right to us. That's not good. Aurelia bit her lip. If the Triumvirate found the Rising's base, they'd all be toast. The revolution would be over before it even began. Calhoun turned to Nossiter. You're right. No one should be going to or coming from the Citadel right now. I'll make sure everyone knows. Nossiter gave a grim nod. You've gotta be kidding! Aurelia resisted the urge to stomp her foot. We can't let monsters or sentinels trap us here. We've gotta fight them both. Nossiter pointed a stern finger at her. It will do the Rising no good if our people keep getting slaughtered by that monster, or if those sentinels discover our headquarters. Exactly. Calhoun looked Aurelia straight in the eye. Don't do anything stupid, kid. Got it? Yeah. Aurelia looked away with a pout. Calhoun and Nossiter continued on their way. Aurelia returned to the library, frustrated beyond belief. She could have been the Rising's best weapon, but Calhoun refused to see that. To be fair, he'd only witnessed her battling supernaturals that drew too close to the Citadel's perimeter, and those creatures had to be dealt blunt force. But she could be stealthy if she wanted to be, and she had to prove it if she was ever going to convince Calhoun to send her on a real mission. She clenched her fist. She was sick of being cooped up, and she hated that the old man's plan was to hide until the danger went away. I'm gonna do something about it. She lifted her chin with fresh resolve. She was certain she could get rid of both the monster and the sentinels without giving away the Citadel's location. If Calhoun wouldn't let her, then she'd have to sneak past him. That would prove how stealthy she could be.